Welcome to The Debate. Today we are dissecting one of the most culturally loaded narratives in the history of the West, the Garden of Eden. But we aren't looking at it as a Sunday school story or, a prehistoric biology lesson. We're analyzing it through the lens of Marie-Noël Fabat's commentaries for the first Sunday of Lent, alongside the work of Thierry Jallas. And the question on the table is, well, it's uncomfortable, perhaps even offensive to the modern ear. Is the autonomy we prize actually killing us?
Yeah, that is the provocation, isn't it? We're looking at a set of texts, Genesis, Romans, and Matthew, that seem to suggest that human independence, the very engine of our civilization, is a trap. The source material frames a stark choice. You can be the master of your own destiny and be miserable, or you can be obedient and be free. And frankly, that sounds like the logic of a totalitarian state, even if it is dressed up in theological language.
I think that's a bit of a reductive reading. I'm taking the position of the source material, that true liberty is found exclusively in radical trust. The argument here is that the law, specifically the prohibitions in Scripture, is not a cage, it is a tree of life. The central thesis we're debating is that what we call sin isn't just breaking a rule, it's a specific psychological state of suspicion against God.
And I am here to challenge that definition entirely. The source material, despite being hosted on a blog that champions liberalism in the classical sense of liberty, presents a complete paradox. It defines freedom as submission. I'll be arguing that the prohibition in Eden creates a necessary conflict. The drive for knowledge and self-determination is inherent in us. I mean, if the law suppresses that, then the law is an impediment to a maturity, not a path to it. If God makes us curious and then punishes curiosity, well, then we have a problem with the Creator, not the creature.
Let's get into the mechanics of this because I think you're maybe missing the genre of the text. To understand Thalabat's argument, you have to accept her starting premise regarding Genesis. She is explicit. The author never pretended to do the work of a historian.
Which is a relief, honestly.
Right, but it's more than just avoiding a debate about evolution. Thalbot insists this is a fable. It was written by a theologian, likely during the reign of Solomon, to answer a crushing philosophical question. If God is good, why is there death? Why is there evil? The author isn't reporting facts, he's constructing a narrative to explain the human condition.
So it's a theodicy, a defense of God's goodness in the face of bad realities.
Exactly. The text emphasizes that God is the liberator, the one who broke the chains of Egypt. So evil cannot come from him. Thalbot argues that the law, symbolized by the forbidden tree, is a protective boundary. Think of it like the railing on a high-rise balcony. The railing isn't there to imprison you, it's there so you can enjoy the view without falling to your death. Her thesis is that the fall wasn't about fruit. It was the moment humans decided that the railing was a prison.
Okay, I understand the railing metaphor. It's a standard apologetic defense, but I think it sanitizes the actual text. The source material highlights a specific, crucial detail. The woman saw that the tree was desirable for gaining intelligence. That is a positive trait. Intelligence is good. Wisdom is good. My position is that the text creates a double bind. God creates a creature with the capacity for reason and the desire for wisdom, places the source of that wisdom within reach, and then forbids it.
But is it wisdom she is reaching for, or is it power?
The text says intelligence. And this, for me, defines liberty as the suppression of curiosity. If Adam is the archetype of the human who wants to determine good and evil for himself, then the text is saying that moral autonomy, the ability to think for oneself, is the root of all death. That is a terrifying claim. It suggests the only safe human is a compliant human.
It suggests the only safe human is a trusting human. And this brings us to the mechanism of the fall, the snake. You see the snake as a liberator of intelligence. Thalabot sees the snake as suspicion incarnate.
Suspicion seems like a loaded term for critical thinking.
No, it's distinct. Look at the dialogue. Thalabot points out a brilliant nuance in the Hebrew. The snake opens with a question. Did God say you shall not eat of any tree?
It's a purposeful exaggeration. God only forbade one.
But look at what that exaggeration does to the woman's mind. It frames the entire relationship around the restriction. Before that question, Adam and Eve lived in a garden of infinite yes. Every tree was theirs. Abundance was the baseline. But the snake's question forces the woman to focus on the single no. It distorts the gaze. Suddenly, the creator isn't the provider of the million trees, he's the miser guarding the one tree. The bud identifies this as the birth of suspicion. The fall wasn't a pursuit of knowledge, it was a collapse of trust based on a false premise.
You call it a false premise. And psychologically, I see how focusing on the negative creates resentment. But let's look at the outcome. The snake says, "Your eyes will be opened." And the text confirms. Then the eyes of both of them were opened. The snake was factually correct.
They were open to what?
To reality. Thabit argues that their gaze was distorted because they saw their nakedness. But I would argue they simply saw the truth. They realized they were vulnerable. They realized they were distinct from God. Isn't that the necessary first step of consciousness? You can't be a free agent if you are just a pet in a garden, blissfully unaware of your own skin.
But look at the immediate reaction to that consciousness. It wasn't empowerment, it was terror. They hid. They tried to sow fig leaves. Thabit argues that this knowledge was actually a fracture. Before they tried to seize the fruit, their nakedness, their limits, their finite nature was fine. It was safe. As soon as they decided, we will be the gods, their limits became a source of shame. They had to hide their reality. That isn't liberty. Living in fear that you aren't enough, constantly trying to cover up your nakedness with status or power, that is a prison.
It's a prison, sure, but it's our prison. It's the human condition. Thabit writes that wanting to eat the fruit is pretending to determine ourselves what is good for us. She posits that only God knows what makes us happy. But if I surrender the right to determine what is good for me, do I not cease to be human? The source material seems to suggest that the only way to be happy is to remain a child who lets the parent pick out their clothes.
Not a child, a beneficiary, a partner. This is the pivot to the second part of our material, which is dense but essential, the two kingdoms in Romans. Thabit breaks down the theology of St. Paul into two columns.
Right, and this is where the theology gets very binary. You have the kingdom of Adam on one side, associated with sin, death, and condemnation, and the kingdom of Christ on the other, grace, life, justification.
But be careful. It's not two groups of people. It's not the Christians versus the atheists. The Bahud is clear. Each is Adam for himself. We are all in both columns simultaneously.
I want to dig into that name, Adam. The source material notes it literally means the earthy one, or the dusty one.
Yes, it connects back to the dust of the ground.
Which I find problematic. If Adam represents the side of death and sin, and Adam means the dusty one, it frames our biology, our material existence, as inherently flawed. It sounds like a rejection of the physical world.
I disagree. The problem isn't being dusty. The problem is refusing to admit you are dust. The source explains that Adam represents the attitude of grasping. It's the human drive to seize life as a possession, to achieve kingship by force. It's the attitude that says, I will make myself great. That path, Paul argues, leads to death because it cuts you off from the source. You're a battery trying to disconnect from the grid to prove you can generate your own power. You die.
And Christ represents what? The battery that stays plugged in?
In a way, yes. Christ represents receiving. He accepts kingship as a gift from the Father. He doesn't grasp. The Buth redefines obedience here. It's not about groveling compliance or mindless rule following. In this context, obedience means trust. It means confidence. And sin is simply distrust. The debate isn't about rules. It's about whether you view the universe as a hostile place where you have to fight for scraps, or a benevolent place where you are provided for.
That is a beautiful distinction, grasping versus receiving. But let's be real. In the world Jawless describes as needing liberal philosophy, the marketplace, politics, academia, we value the grasper. We value the self-made man. We build statues to the people who seized destiny by the throat. This theology essentially says that the self-made man is the definition of the damned.
Precisely, because the self-made man is alone. And in the logic of this fable, isolation is death. The law given at Sinai, which Thabit links to the tree of life, is the instruction manual for connection. If you ignore the manual because you want to be independent, you break the machine. You crash the system.
Okay, let's test this instruction manual theory. Because sometimes the manual itself is the weapon. We move from the garden to the desert in Matthew 4. Jesus is starving. The devil shows up. If the law is a safety railing, why does the interaction get so messy here?
Because the devil is smart. Thabit reminds us of the etymology, diabolos, the divider. He wants to separate Jesus from his identity as a son who trusts his father. He tempts him to use his power for himself, turn these stones to bread.
Which, frankly, seems reasonable for a starving man. If you have the power to feed yourself, why starve?
Because the hunger isn't the point. The point is reliance. But I want to highlight the second temptation because it directly addresses your concern about the law. The devil takes Jesus to the top of the temple, and what does he do? He quotes the Bible.
Psalm 91, he will give his angels charge of you.
Exactly. The divider quotes the scripture to tempt Jesus. He uses the instruction manual to tell Jesus to jump off a building.
And that is where your law as safety argument shakes a bit. If the devil can quote the Bible to justify self-destruction, then the text isn't a safety railing, it's a loaded gun. This proves religious texts are not inherently safe. The test isn't just obeying the text, it's interpreting it correctly against an adversary who also knows the text.
That is the critical pivot point. The text itself isn't magic. It can be weaponized. The devil uses the text to tempt Jesus into testing God. The logic is, if I jump, God must catch me because he promised in the book. That is an attempt to manipulate God. It's Adam behavior again, trying to control the outcome. It's grasping.
So the divider uses the manual of connection to break the connection. That's clever.
And Jesus counters not by arguing interpretation, but by correcting the attitude. He quotes Deuteronomy, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test." He refuses to force God's hand. Adam tested the prohibition. Jesus refuses to test the promiser. He remains in the posture of a son, not a rival. He chooses to trust the silence rather than force a miracle.
I'll grant you that. Jesus displays incredible intellectual discipline there. He refuses to claim God's protection as a right. But this leads us to the final and perhaps most difficult psychological aspect of this commentary. We have to talk about the beggar.
This comes from the commentary on Psalm 51. This is King David's prayer after his horrific abuse of power, adultery with Bathsheba, the murder of her husband Uriah. David acted like the ultimate Adam. He saw, he wanted, he took. He was the king, he was the grasper.
And when the prophet Nathan confronts him, David crumbles. But Thabit highlights something curious about the nature of God's forgiveness here. She notes that Nathan announces the pardon immediately. The Lord has put away your sin, before David does penance, before he fixes anything.
It's instantaneous, but Thabit draws attention to the vocabulary David uses. He asks for pity, PTA. Thabit notes that this word shares a root with alms or charity. She writes, "We are beggars before God."
And that is where I hit the wall. The idea that to be in a right relationship with the divine, I must view myself as a beggar. Thabit writes that God is magnetized by misery. That creates a psychological dynamic where my worth is tied to my wretchedness. If I have to be a beggar to be loved, isn't that just a different kind of humiliation? It feels like the text demands I destroy my self-esteem to fit into this system.
I think you're reading beggar as worthless. But in the context of the garden in the fall, beggar simply means honest. Think back to the fig leaves. Adam and Eve tried to cover up. They pretended they weren't naked. They pretended they were self-sufficient. David, in Psalm 51, rips off the fig leaves. He says, "I have nothing. I am empty. I have no currency to buy my way out of this murder."
So the beggar is just someone who stops pretending they are solvent?
Exactly. I'd argue that acknowledging one's poverty, our contingency, the fact that we didn't create ourselves and can't sustain ourselves, is the only way to be real. You cannot receive a gift if your hands are clenched shut, holding on to your own pride. The boot says the gift is not like the fault. The grace is abundant, But you can't fill a cup that is already full of itself. You have to be empty to receive.
It's a coherent system, I admit. If you accept the premise that we are contingent beings, that we are dust, then acting like we are self-sufficient gods is a delusion. And delusion leads to crashing the system, as you put it.
And that's what the Tree of Life offers. Freedom from the delusion. You don't have to be God, you just have to be a human, trusting the one who is God. It lifts the weight of the world off your shoulders. You don't have to define good and evil. You just have to listen.
We are nearing the end of our time, and the tension remains. I see the immense psychological relief in the liberty of obedience. It removes the crushing burden of having to invent your own morality. It solves the existential dread. But I maintain that the source material demands a surrender of the critical faculty. If the snake is suspicion, then faith is the suspension of suspicion. And in a complicated world, suspending suspicion is a high-risk gamble. The woman saw the fruit was good for intelligence. I cannot fault her for reaching for it, even if the price was paradise.
And I would summarize by saying that the intelligence she gained was the knowledge of fear. Thabot's reading offers a different kind of intelligence, the wisdom of the two kingdoms. You can live in the kingdom of Adam, grasping for control, hiding your nakedness and fighting for scraps, or you can live in the kingdom of Christ, accepting life as a gift with nothing to prove and nothing to hide.
It brings us back to that quote from St. Francis de Sales that Magellan puts on his banner: "Nothing by force, everything by love."
That is the synthesis. God didn't force Adam to obey. He didn't put an electric fence around the tree. He doesn't force us. The text presents a choice between two fundamental orientations of the human heart: clutching the fist to grasp or opening the hand to receive.
A choice that is as relevant in the desert of our modern lives as it was in the garden. We leave it to you, the listener, to decide which fruit you are reaching for.
Thank you for joining the debate.